Thank you. Thank you, Francis. I'm guessing by talking about the axe, you can see my screen okay. That's
Yes,
all
I can
fine.
see it, and I
Yeah,
hope everybody else can too. Yeah.
perfect. Okay. So I already had an introduction, but my project is investigating one of the largest and most significant sources of Neolithic axe production in Britain, Craiglwyd in North Wales. So I'm going to talk today about my research and outline some of the research questions that I'm hoping to address, as I'm sure you can appreciate, I'm in my second year, so I don't have a full set of results to present, but I will be presenting some preliminary results of some analysis and mapping exercises today. Oh, that didn't change. Oh, there we go. Okay, so despite being one of the first major axe production sites discovered in Britain, Group 7 axes, as they are classified according to the Implement Petrology Group, and the landscape that they were produced within, have been largely overlooked and neglected by archaeologists until recently. My research is undertaking a major programme of lithic analysis and landscape surveys with the aim of bringing understanding of the production of Group 7 axes and the context of this production to a similar level as other major production sites in Britain. So, first and foremost, my research hopes to answer the question, where and how did axe production occur in this landscape, and how does this vary? What factors might have influenced this variation? And then finally, what can a deeper understanding of axe production tell us about the importance of these places and landscapes to Neolithic people? And it's this question that I'll expand on in the second half of the presentation, looking at the production, destruction, and deposition of rough outs and finished axes. So, a bit of background. The most well-known site of Group 7 axe is, of course, the site of Craiglwyd. This refers to a specific outcrop that sits above the town of Penmanmawr in North Wales. And the Neolithic axe sites of Craiglwyd were discovered in 1919 by Hazeldean Warren. But at the same time, Warren also discovered evidence of axe production over a much wider area. But despite that, most attention has been spent on the site of Craiglwyd itself, and it's only recently that the full extent of axe production in this landscape has been investigated. Now, the geology of the site is really important. So, Penmanmawr Mountain, which is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's about there, is an igneous intrusion that dates from the Ordovician period, and it is known as microdiorite. In the centre of this intrusion, the rock is relatively coarse, but on the margins of the intrusion, at sites like Craiglwyd and others that I'll be mentioning in this presentation, the rock is a fine-grained texture. As you can see in this photo, there's a very fine-grained seam here at Craiglwyd Quarry, and it fractures with a conchoidal fracture. And it's these margins where we find this fine-grained rock is where we find the most evidence for axe production. So the major sites that have been the major production sites that have been identified so far are Corsicanadau, the slopes of Dinas and a farm called Tynichaivan and Garagfawr, all to the west of Craiglwyd. But it's also important to mention that there's axe production flakes found all over this landscape, particularly within this sheltered basin here known as Faen Llanfer, between the site of Tynichaivan and Maes Bryn, which is the location of a possible contemporary settlement location. So Warren was the first to discover and excavate the site in 1919, although it seems very likely that local knowledge of axes and waste material was probably well known significantly prior to this, due to the extensive amount of modern quarrying and agriculture in this landscape.
Mhm.
But Warren excavated multiple sites over a 3 year period. It's estimated that he collected around 3 tons of material, over 1,100 rough outs, as well as a small amount of waste and other retouch tools. And they went to museums all around Britain and also internationally. The next major phase of investigation, it didn't really happen until the 90s. But it's a bit misleading because, of course, there were things happening in this landscape. There's a very strong local tradition of field walking and collecting, but academically that work is largely invisible. So the next time we kind of hear about Craiglood is 1992, when Gwynedd Archaeological Trust and University of Bangor undertake the first systematic survey of Craiglood, as well as the immediate region around that. And most significantly, their work uncovers evidence of prehistoric quarrying directly on the rock outcrop itself, in the form of a large flake scar, which is pictured here. The current project investigating Group 7 axes is the Landscape of Neolithic Axes project, and this is part of the Cardiff Landscape Partnership Scheme, a 5-year heritage lottery funded project led by Parker Airy. The project is a partnership between Heneb, Penman Mawr Museum, as well as the park, and its primary aims are to learn more about how axe making was spread across this landscape, but also to work with local communities and get them involved in the investigations as well. The project's undertaken 4 years of test pitting across 4 sites circled in this map here, and have uncovered a major assemblage of axe production debitage, roughouts, and a small amount of evidence for flint and pottery as well. And this assemblage really presents a unique opportunity to investigate axe production on this landscape level. So it's this assemblage and it's those sites mentioned that are the basis of my PhD. I'm undertaking a major programme of lithic analysis on this assemblage in order to understand this production. This is taking both a quantitative and qualitative approach to the technology in order to gain a holistic understanding of the production sequence. And the results of this analysis will be mapped using GIS in order to identify variation in technologies within the 4 sites and between the 4 sites. To facilitate the analysis, I've had a series of axes produced experimentally, and the purpose of this was really to characterise the debitage from broadly 3 distinct stages of the axe production process, so preliminary, intermediate and finishing. And then the debitage was subject to the same level of analysis as the archaeological assemblage in order to facilitate those comparisons. And then the aim is to use the knowledge gained from this reference collection to try and see if we can identify those stages of production in the archaeology and see if we can map those and identify any specific areas of activity. So all of this is used to answer that first research question, where and how was axe production undertaken, and can we identify any patterns? When I've completed the analysis of the debitage from the excavations, which is ongoing, and I'll be able to provide this insight into how axes are being made through this lens of technology and production stage. However, the other element of this project is aiming to try and understand the significance of places through this lens of axe production. So I'm going to focus the rest of the presentation talking about how I'm beginning to address this question by looking at the production, destruction and deposition of roughouts and finished axes. So just to wind back a little bit, a roughout is simply an unfinished form of a stone axe, and they can vary a lot in their stage of production, their form, as well as the type of blank that's been used to produce them. The roughouts that have been collected from close to the stone sources through the recent and the antiquarian excavations are nearly always in a very preliminary or intermediate stage of production. Okay. And in my analysis of the roughouts from the recent excavations and also from museum collections, I've shown that pieces of scree as well as large flakes were both used as blanks for roughout production. However, pieces of scree were more common. Nearly half of the roughouts in which a blank could be identified were made on pieces of scree. I'll just show you what the scree looks like. It's just a mass of loose, kind of small and medium-sized fragmented stones that accumulates on a slope. Interestingly, this really ties into some evidence that we have at Corsair Conedau, which revealed possible sorting and stacking of scree pieces, as shown in this drawing down here. Indicating that Neolithic people were perhaps sorting through layers of scree to identify a piece that was a suitable form and size for producing a roughout. Of course, I've mentioned that we do have evidence for quarrying on the outcrops themselves, but so far it is quite limited, suggesting that collection of scree was the most important means of extracting suitable stone. Of the roughouts that I've analysed so far from the excavations and museums, over half of these have been described as being broken transversely. And the images on this slide just show a 3D model of two roughouts from the recent excavations that demonstrate these transverse breaks. Now, this can be a common napping error made during early roughout production, particularly if there's a flaw present in the material or perhaps inexperience of the axe maker. Most roughouts, when they've been broken like this, are then seemingly discarded and don't really show signs of being worked any further. However, I have identified a small amount of roughouts that were potentially broken intentionally. Evidence for this deliberate breaking, it comes in the form of in these very invasive transverse removals that terminate in a step fracture. Only a portion of the removal is still visible, as the rest would have been on the other broken half of the roughout. And I describe these removals as overkill when there's no explanation for why such a large blow would have been attempted, such as the removal of a lump or a flaw on the surface of the roughout, and interpret these as possible deliberate breaking of the roughout. And I think this is possibly further supported by the fact that the roughouts are not further worked, despite some of them still being of a significant size. Perhaps roughouts were being deliberately broken when the form of the roughout was becoming increasingly asymmetrical. We can see in finished Group 7 axes that symmetry was a really important aim, and there's also evidence of the importance of symmetry in Group 6 axes from Great Langdale and Cumbria, as well as really just finished axes of all types. But perhaps it wasn't enough to just reject the roughouts that were becoming asymmetrical, and instead they needed to be deliberately broken and then discarded. There's difficulties with interpreting this in such a fragmented archaeological assemblage, as well as just the generally worn condition of some of these roughouts collected from the surface as well. However, it is easier to identify deliberate breakage on finished axes. So there's several sites that demonstrate axes being deliberately broken down in the immediate area. Evidence from the henge complex at Llandergau presents as a blade end of a polished axe, which again has been broken transversely, flaked with these two very invasive flake removals, alongside several flakes that are described as medallion shaped and have these polished dorsal surfaces. Very similar evidence comes from the adjacent site of Park Bryn Cegin, which is an assemblage from 3 Neolithic pits. Again, it demonstrates this destructive sequence of breaking down a polished axe in the form of flakes that are described as medallion shaped with these polished dorsal surfaces interpreted to have top sliced off the face of a polished axe, alongside a fragment of a polished axe as well. And it is possible that similar activity is also happening at the chambered tomb site of Bryn Bobl on Ynys Môn on Anglesey. This site is a bit more of a complicated picture, with axe production possibly occurring alongside retouching of microdiorite flakes into scrapers. However, some of the flakes do demonstrate this kind of medallion shape. I mean, this one is broken, but medallion shape with these polished dorsal surfaces. So possibly showing another example of deliberately breaking down a polished axe alongside some other activities as well. Now, there are evidence of fragmented polished axes close to the stone source as well. So from two sites, from Cardiff itself and from Maesy Bryn, that possible settlement location that I mentioned. Here we have polished axes that have been reflaked. However, unlike the axes in the previous 3 sites, these appear to nearly always have been reflaked on their blade ends when the blade is available, and this is probably for functional reasons, to rejuvenate the axe and resharpen the blades. There's no real evidence in the previous sites mentioned that breaking down is happening for these resharpening purposes, as it appears to be here, thus suggesting that the deliberate breaking down of axes might have played a more symbolic role, as has been interpreted at Park Bryn Cegin, and their association with the henges, particularly at Llandergau and the tomb at Bryn Bobl, indicates that their presence and possibly this action of breaking down might symbolise something important around putting the axes out of use prior to deposition. and this is possibly a different role than the axes that are being deliberately broken and the rough outs that are being deliberately broken close to the stone source, suggesting that the symbolic significance of these axes might change as they move away from the sources. So on that note, my final slide is a little bit about how axes are moving away from the sources. So I'm going to show two distribution maps that demonstrate how rough outs and polished axes are found in the immediate area, and this data comes from the HER, from recent excavations from museum collections, and each point indicates where a rough out has been found rather than how many rough outs. The distribution maps demonstrate that there's a really high concentration of rough outs found close to the stone source, which is obvious, you would expect that. A few other find spots around kind of northwest Wales, but then a particular concentration on Ynys Môn, and particularly in this southern half here. This is also reflected in the polished axes, where you've got this concentration in the southern half here. Now, because these axes come from a variety of different find spots, excavations, field walking, it's difficult to tie them together, and it's difficult to tie them with any other evidence for the early Neolithic that we have on Anglesey. But we do know that there's two very significant settlement sites dating to the early Neolithic period, the site of Parc Cubby and the site of Llanfaiflew. So it seems like this was probably a very important and busy place in the early Neolithic that possibly had strong ties with Cardiff as well. So just to wrap up, I've got a lot of further work on understanding how to identify deliberate fragmentation and then interpreting the significance of it within the different contexts. And I plan on drawing upon recent work by Matthew Knight on fragments of metal objects in the Bronze Age hoards, and David Fontaine's work on transformation through destruction in the Iron Age to develop these ideas. Once the debitage analysis is complete from the excavations, I'll be able to provide an in-depth overview of the structure of stoneworking at the four sites and between the four sites as well, and this will allow comparisons to be drawn with other similar studies, such as Langdale in Cumbria. Further work is also really needs to be done on the outcrops at the four different sites to identify whether there's any further evidence of quarrying as well. And then finally, it's really important to contextualise all of this evidence with what else is going on in North Wales in the Neolithic, and I believe that this is the way that the social significance of production is going to be understood further. What I've presented today is a very, very preliminary attempt at doing that, so I really welcome any further questions, feedback and comments. I just want to say thank you to my supervisory team and to all of the volunteers who were involved in the Landscape of Neolithic Axes project. That's me.